All right, let's get right into it now with the continuation of last week's session, as we ran out of time, or I spoke far too long about certain topics. But nonetheless, today should be fairly quick, just to really round off where we finished off last week, and it'll set the scene for the next session that we'll schedule for a week from now. So kicking straight into it, and I think I just really need to say thanks again to our sponsors who make this possible. That's Corby Speech Analytics. That's the only South African developed analytics, call center analytics tool that handles English, Afrikaans, isiZulu, and Sesotho. Really proud of what they've achieved down there. Smart Solutions, an incredible omni-channel call center technology platform, well worth having a look at. And new kids on the block in Tele BPO, and we have Jackie with us today. Welcome, Jackie. It's a high-touch, high-care, digitally enabled BPO operation, and we're anticipating seeing great things coming from there. And Axtel headsets. I'm not wearing one today, unfortunately. I had some problems with configurations, but this is world-class contact center headsets. So much for the commercials. Let's get straight into it. And today we'll be looking at customer experience, the continuation of that, bearing in mind that everything that we talk about in the Masterclass series is about concepts, it's about ideas, it's about some instances recommended best practice. It is not a training session, so it's really there to stimulate thought and to stimulate ideas. So we'll get right into CX, customer experience. As you saw from last week's slide sequence, CX is really a continuation or an evolution of the early days where we were looking at customer satisfaction, we're looking at CRM, customer and relationship management, and we're now into the CX phase. So let's have a look at it. So I think an important issue here is I like to differentiate between the two different perspectives on CX. So let's not confuse them. And the big difference is CX or CRM is a business strategy, important differentiator, and is separated from CX or CRM, the technologies. Now, why I make such a big point about this is that back in the 90s and even as far as into the early 2000s, a lot of organizations were, dare I use the term, bamboozled into buying extremely complicated and expensive so-called CRM technologies or software that was promoted as being the be-all and end-all of customer management and the end of any problems and challenges associated with that. Regretfully, many organizations are still saddled with the legacies of the old CRM. The differentiator here is let's separate the CRM as a business strategies and the implications of that, and then the CRM or CX, the technologies, and never the twain shall meet. They're related, but certainly not one and the same. So let's look at the business strategy. First and foremost, it is all encompassing. It has to come from the boardroom. It has to be endorsed by the executives. It has to be part of the organizational culture. I know many of us are shaking our heads here and saying, that's not the case with my organization, but that's what we're here for, is to change perspectives. So let's have a look at some of the fundamentals here. If we really take CRM or CX seriously, the very first thing we have in place or have to put into place is consolidation of all customer information and knowledge about that customer to give us a single view of customer. Once again, this is where we shudder and think, how many legacy systems and parallel systems and multiple databases do we have in our organization that make it almost impossible to have that single view of customer? Nonetheless, a lot of developments in technologies and systems and platforms now allow us to have as close as possible to the single view of customer. So fundamental principle of CX is that single view of customer. The second component of it drives analytics. So first and foremost, we have that single view of customer and access to all of the data supporting that customer and our relationship with that customer, and we need to start analyzing that data. Third principle of CX is understanding customer behavior. Once again, notwithstanding the massive volumes of data in some instances, if you think of the banks and insurance organizations and multi-choice, for example, there's masses and masses of information and data. Nonetheless, if we drive through and we use the appropriate tools, analytics tools, it is imperative to our strategy, CRM or CX strategy, that we understand the customer behaviors in that sense. So let's move on to that. Once we have an understanding of customer behaviors, that is when we start crafting those interactive, personalized, appropriate, and relevant interactions. And I'd like us to pause on that just for a moment and just look at those components. Interactive, personalized, appropriate, and relevant. I think today's consumer has a short fuse. It's easily emotionally disturbed, if you like, by what he would or she might call spamming. And so it's critically important that we look at this, that interactive, there's got to be a bilateral communications channels in the first instance. It's got to be personalized. It's got to be appropriate to the customer. It's got to be relevant to their relationship with us. So I suggest you make a really big note about those four, because fundamental to where we're going on this program. Because once we have those in place, single view of customer, the ability to analyze, driving through and starting to understand the customer behavior, and then those relevant interactions. Now we can use our systems, technology, and our strategies to drive for customer acquisition. Critically important to any organization looking for new customers, new revenues, revenue growth, market share, etc. Similarly, and we'll go on to it in more detail in later today's session, customer retention. The lifeblood of profit is customer retention. I'll repeat that because it's really important. Profit is a consequence of customer retention. We'll expand on that shortly. Increased revenues, as you can see, if we understand customer behavior, if we really have the deep analytics, if we're engaging with relevant and appropriate interactions, we will drive new product upsells, cross-sells, and incremental revenue, lifetime value of customer as well. We can certainly look at reducing operational costs once we've achieved this level of integration, because it's quicker, faster, easier to communicate with our customers and for our customers to communicate with us. And therefore, it shortens average handling time, which, as we know, and we'll discuss in more detail, is a costly component. So we then have reduced customer effort, which is a topic we discussed last week. Where we can reduce customer effort, we drive retention, we drive loyalty, we drive revenue increases. So a critical component of our CX mix. Customer satisfaction, that we drive beyond satisfaction into the realms of delight and even further into advocacy. So those key points of single view of customer and the systems to drive it will certainly drive our highly desirable strategies. And there they are: acquisition, retention, revenues, reduced costs, reduced effort, customer satisfaction, and customer loyalty. So that's what we're setting out to achieve with customer experience or enhanced CRM. There's the last one, customer advocacy. So let's burn that into our minds, because that's our agenda going forward. So now the business strategy taken further, and a couple of definitions in here. The art and science, isn't that a nice term, art and science, using information to find, acquire, and to retain customers. Once again, it goes back to data and the analytics behind it. Another sometimes contentious view is CX is the people, processes, and technologies associated with marketing, sales, and service. And this is where we start bumping heads with our colleagues in marketing and sales, because contact center has generally been put into service only. And this is why it's imperative that the organization sees CX or CRM in a global sense. It's across all business units, across all touch points. There it's defined as a corporate philosophy at the core of any customer-centric business. Any business nowadays will claim to be customer-centric, but unless they can achieve these points that we've raised on the previous slide, it's doubtful. So another lesson to be learned in the boardroom. This point is very important, supported by and not driven by technology. The point I made on those previous slides, where technology vendors come into an organization claiming to have the be-all and end-all of CRM or customer experience with their various technology platforms, and notwithstanding the fact that many of them are in fact brilliant and wonderful to work in certain areas, they do not, in my opinion, automatically just change the whole way in which we engage with customers. So those contact center or CRM or ERP systems that claim to have the solution really dictate that the organization would have to change its processes, its methods, its very core systems to align with the standard features of those solutions. They claim that it can be customized, but that is at immense cost in most cases to organizations. So we've got to be very careful that CRM or CX is supported by appropriate technologies and not driven by the basic features of those technologies. However, CX, if we do it properly at a strategic level, involves redesigning of functional activities of organizations. If we have the relevant data, if we have the will and the drive and the ability to analyze and to engage in a highly personalized way with our customers, it will mean having to redesign a lot of the functional features within our organizations. So process re-engineering is key to many of the things we need to do. We need also at all times to actively deepen the knowledge of customers in order to meet their specific needs. Now, that's a high-level statement, actively deepening the knowledge of customers. It's one of the things I use when I'm consulting with call centers, is every single call in or out of a contact center is a unique opportunity to gather one more important piece of information about that customer. It's a 5 or a 10-second question. It's a tick box on the CRM system, but it means that every time we engage, we have the ability to either automatically, through data extracts and analytics, gather another piece of information about a customer, or by asking it specifically. So I put that on the agenda as well, is look for ways in which we can gather ever deepening knowledge of customers. Back to the strategic side, it's a holistic approach unifying all points of customer interaction. Once again, it's something we all see, tragically, is that the messages, the methods of communications through the contact center or the call center are often very different to the experience that the customer might have in a retail environment or a walking environment. Extremely different. So important that we strategize and implement those strategies right across the organization and all touch points. Holistic approach. How do we measure it? First and foremost, doing this correctly is going to be expensive. There's no two ways about it. Whether it is integration of systems, the deployment of new omni-channel platforms and solutions, analytics, data analytics, more training, etc. It's going to be expensive. There's no question about it. However, if we can measure it and show value to our organization, the costs are very often, in most cases, justifiable. So customer experience and the ROI on it, we measure by customer retention, in the first instance, referrals, which indicate advocacy. We can then measure growth in various customer segments, whether it is growth by account numbers or numbers of new business accounts opening or by revenues. Whichever way we do it, we must have in place those methods to measure how successful these strategies are once they are deployed. So CX as a business strategy, important that those issues are taken to account at a strategic level, and that there's buy-in in the boardroom to the concepts that are embedded in this particular set of principles. Now let's have a look at the technologies. Later on, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll start looking at some of the appropriate technologies that drive CX. But let's have a look at some of the principles. Unlike back in the early 2000s, where some vendors were claiming that their product, their single CRM solution, drove all the features and benefits that we would want to drive strategy. However, it's my personal opinion that CX or CRM technologies are a suite of applications. It's not a single application. So we're going to be very careful about how we define and spec what it is that we need. So first and foremost, it integrates other systems. If we don't have those levels of integration into those legacy systems, be it back-end mainframes, other applications, back to that single view of customer, that's the fundamental principle that we'd be looking for in this suite of applications. It would be ease and speed of integration and ease of deployment of those tools. Secondly, we need to look at what functions do these software, these applications have that facilitate the coordination of business functions. So it's an aspect of integration, but as you'll see, this manifests as process automation. And once again, we've been looking very carefully at whatever solutions there might be that address this, coordinate different business functions. There's our automation. So fortunately, a lot of the systems that we're looking at today in the customer interaction platforms have very powerful process automation tools as an integral feature. Unification of communication channels. For the last 30 years, we've struggled with multi-channel environments. Telephony on the one hand, voice, email, text messaging. Now we're faced with social channels, etc. And it's been a multi-channel environment. And today we cannot get away with anything less than a totally synchronized omni-channel platform or solution. So that will address this unification of communication channels. Although in some cases we're seeing still some weaknesses in these systems, as a lot of front-end and walk-in situations are not actually being taken seriously as appropriate channels. And so we have this, demand for a suite of solutions or a single solution that's made up of components of integrated or made up of integrated components, consistent delivery of standardized and logical processes. This also goes back to that previous slide where we talked about the need for re-engineering, reprocessing, rethinking how we do business. So fortunately, given the right tools to do this, it facilitates the ability to redesign and look at our processes very carefully again. So I just reinforce that. Business process, automation, and workflow, high on the agenda of any investigation into new systems or processes that we might be looking at. Okay, You might have seen the slide before, and you're going to see it a lot more in our series, but it just reinforces once again at every stage of stop, we'll share the slide again, those operational challenges. So in the context of CX CRM, key operational challenges are still reduce your cost of operations. And we can do that by re-engineering our business, by deploying appropriate technologies, and getting the right mindset throughout the organization, from the boardroom down to operations. Efficiencies, as you've seen from those previous slides, if we redesign our processes and deploy the appropriate technologies, we will drive efficiencies, which in turn will increase our revenues, whether it is through retention, loyalty, upsells, cross-sells, collections, whatever it may be. Reducing risks, not only financial risks through the ability to really drive analytics in the first instance, but also brand and reputational risk, critical component of the modern contact center. And not last, but certainly not least, is increased customer satisfaction, however we choose to define that. So those are, once again, our 5 key drivers. Why deploy CX and CRM, enhanced CRM? Why deploy sophisticated omni-channel platforms? Well, there are 5 very good reasons. And the rider to that, of course, is we know that all our budgets are being held back and cut, and we're under pressure, etc., and cutbacks in training budgets. So we have the challenge of having to do a whole lot more, certainly with a whole lot less. So, and let's not compromise on quality. So let that settle in for a moment before we go on to the next section. Any questions at this time? I don't see anything coming through on the Q&A line. The chat line is open. Hi, Carlos, welcome. And anybody else? No messaging. So let's go to the next. So we've looked at the strategic component of CX, and let's have a look at, what can the business do, assuming that is mandated from the boardroom, that the appropriate budgets are approved. What can we do with these wonderful new world? Overall, a high level on it is, providing better customer service. That's really what we in contact centers are there to do. That's our job, provide better customer service, however we define that. We're under increasing pressure to prove and to show consistent growth in customer revenues. As we saw in the last session, there are different ways in which we can start measuring ourselves and reporting as contact center in all matters relating to customer revenues. Acquisition, new customers. Once we have analytics, once we have accurate customer data, and we have customer behavior models in place, it's time to start getting proactive and personalized proactive, whether it is through text messaging, WhatsApp messaging, personalized, emails, and outbound telephony. All of these things are going to drive a better relationship with customers, and certainly drive those other 2, which is customer service and customer revenues. At the same time, providing us that opportunity to upsell and cross-sell products. All about revenue, revenue, revenue. Show me the money. That little point there helps sales staff close deals faster, particularly if we are in the collection space or the sales space, etc. Call duration is a critical factor, and it's something we'll discuss in a lot more detail in one of our other sessions that will focus purely on how to build costing models that allow us to look at the cost per second, per minute, per interaction, by interaction type, etc. So the faster we can close those deals, the lower our operational costs, and therefore contribution to bottom line profits. Efficiencies, efficiencies, efficiencies. If we take average call center and we were able to increase overall efficiency by 10%, that's depending on how you structure your contact center, it's a massive cost saving to the organization. Back to where we butt heads with our good friends in sales and marketing. There are a lot of things that we can do from the contact center, given the right tools and strategies, that will simplify and streamline both marketing, sales, product awareness, and attraction into the sales environment, and then the sales and the closing of sales. A lot of that can be simplified and can be automated. So, the types of projects, if you like, that we can use to achieve organizational goals. What could we do if we were given these tools to deploy in our organization? First and foremost, we would make sure that from the outset that our customer contact data is squeaky clean. It's 100% clean. I think I mentioned in one of our previous sessions that some research done by the Direct Marketing Association a few years ago showed conclusively that at a corporate level, we're talking banks, insurance companies, etc., that there was over 50% of customer data had flaws in it and faults. And so it's imperative that we make sure that we have accurate customer contact data. If we can't contact them, we can't sell to them, we can't upsell to them, we can't foster the relationship, and heaven forbid, we can't collect from them if the necessity arises. Once again, we are able, given the tools of the trade, so to speak, to start building accurate customer profiles and segmentation models that allow our good friends in marketing to target more specific campaigns with appropriate offerings to these segments or within our customer profiles. Customer profile at an individual customer level also very clearly starts showing us a model of their space in life. Are they single? Are they married? Do they have kids? What age of the kids are? What are the sports, hobbies, interests, etc.? The deeper we have knowledge about that customer in his or her personal environment, the greater our opportunity to build relationships, to build loyalty, to build advocacy, and to build revenues. Our friends in marketing. There's an old adage in sales and marketing and advertising that says half of the advertising budget works and the other half doesn't. And nobody's ever been able to work out which half is which. And the same goes to a lot of marketing, where it's historically been extremely difficult, if not impossible, is to quantify the return on investment of marketing. Nowadays, more and more, before we spend money on marketing, we need to put into place the mechanisms that allow us to measure response to campaigns, response to investments made in marketing. Once again, if we do it correctly, not only the technologies, we're going to need to do a lot of process design, we're going to need to do a lot of training to make sure that our frontline staff are gathering this type of information. Sales and purchasing data, critically important to have that historical record, to have it on the screen, customer touch points and customer history on screen with a single view of customer, so that our frontline people can address the issues, whether it is in a sales environment, of what the customers bought, when they bought it, what are their buying cycles. Deepening that knowledge of customer will enable us to do huge amounts of activities to drive additional and incremental sales. Here's a very interesting one. Many organizations drag around, some cases tens of thousands, if not millions, of unprofitable customers, where there's a lack of ability within the organization or within the systems to actually measure profitability or lack of profitability. Now, let's assume we had 200,000 customers in our CRM system, and that over a period of time we were able to carry out some analytics that showed that a particular group of those customers were not profitable at all. The first phase obviously would be to look at it very carefully and to look at what activities could we drive into that segment to turn them from being unprofitable to more profitable. Then there's another last leg of that loop, is how brave are we to actually drop those customers off our books in a way that does not negatively affect our brand image or our reputation, or alienate those customers. So that's a topic for another day, and there's some really interesting case studies of companies that have identified low profit or no profit customers, have identified the cost of retaining them on their books, and have successfully worked through campaigns to move those customers out of their environment. And in one case, you'll have to wait for that, it's another case study where a company actually migrated their unprofitable customers to their competitors. That was a lot of fun. Account and billing information, obviously, and very important nowadays is channel preference. In fact, I should change the order of these and put channel preference right up front, because if we know a particular customer has a preference for a social channel, then we have no other option other than to communicate back on that same channel. So those channel preferences are really, really important, and they will grow in importance going on. Predictable churn and loss of customer. Once again, if we analyze that customer information appropriately, and we start picking up trends and we start picking up segments, it's possible to see with a great degree of accuracy the predictable churn or loss of customers. I'll give you a little case study here, or an example. It was going back nearly 20 years, I suppose, if I look back on it, a particular life insurance company that I shall remain nameless. They've subsequently merged and no longer standing alone. But at that time, 20 years ago, the situation was that their field sales staff were not keeping up with the number of cancellations. So on a bad month, they would have, let's say, 1,000 new policies, but there would be 1,500 policy cancellations. And that is obviously a ridiculous situation. When we started looking at the data, the cancellations was also a process problem, in as much as that a call coming into the call center where a customer wanted to cancel a policy had no retention program in place whatsoever. The call center agent would simply ask for the address to which to post the refund check or the cancellation check or whatever the policy was worth, the surrender value. And that was very sad. However, once we started drilling down and analyzing the data, we found that a lot of these cancellations are coming from a similar group of people, that just before the third debit order, the cancellation would come in. So first, second would go through, third one would fail. We started asking the customers, and we found that there was a lot of cases, there was call it domestic dispute between spouses, where the husband, in this particular instance, was a blue-collar worker who signed a debit order for whatever it was, and by the time the third month came around, this is where domestic stress kicked in. So identifying that as a particular pattern, the client then implemented a rather sneaky trick. First and foremost, we had a customer retention team put into place, appropriately trained, and in many cases, those people calling for cancellations simply had a short-term cash problem. It was a family bereavement, a funeral, something like that. In which case, the company was able to do short-term loans or premium deferments. That was an easy part, and I think about 25 to 30% of those potential cancellations were actually saved through the retentions team. The predictable churn that campaign that was created was that we put together an outbound call center team that called customers in the period just between the second and third debit order, right in the middle of that. And that call advised the customer that there was extra policy, feature to the policy at no additional cost. In that case, it was additional bus hire cover for funeral policies. And secondly, there was a welcome aboard gift of a 100 Rand shopping voucher. Now, 20 years ago, a 100 Rand shopping voucher was a lot of money. And literally overnight, that churn ratio turned completely from over 50%, or in some cases 100% in 1 month of cancellations over new signups, turned to around about a 10 to 15% cancellation, which is fairly much an industry norm. So it's a bit of a long story, but bear in mind that predictable churn, because it's not rocket science to find those trigger points and then to craft the campaigns and the approaches that mitigate those churns. Any questions coming up? I don't see anything in the chat line, in the Q&A line. Feel free to jump in, and even if you want to speak, we're not a big group today, so I can always let you in to actually get your opinions on something. So just highlighting channel preferences, massive cost savings and opportunities. If a customer's channel preference is WhatsApp, imagine how much money we would save diverting them out of a voice call in the call center. We can turn that predictable churn into massive upsell and cross-sell opportunities. So bear that in mind, and we can always discuss other ways in which we can identify that churn. This brings me to two of my favorite slides. This is the first of two, and it's about customer retention. And if we go back to this absolutely amazing book, which I can highly recommend, written by Mr. Fred Reichelt. Now, Mr. Reichelt goes all the way back to, you remember Net Promoter? Well, Fred Reichelt was the original author of the Net Promoter methodology, and he still owns copyright on that. However, his first book, together with William Sasser, this was published around about 2000, and his second book now, Ultimate Questions, all deal with customer retention. And I've only got 2 slides to show it here, but basically what the research shows is that if we can manage customer retention, we manage profit. I'll repeat that because it's so important. If we can manage customer retention, we can manage profit. So once again, this points to the role of the modern contact center or customer interaction center, and what can we do to make ourselves not only respected out of the boardroom, but supported in anything we want to do. So let's have a look at this. So here's our axis here, percentage increase in profit. And I kid you not, we are dealing with post-tax profit. In other words, the real stuff that drives organizational profit and profit shares and share value, etc., etc. So what this model is saying is profit impact of a 5% increase in the rate of customer retention. You saw in the slides we showed last week that many companies are resigned to the fact that they lose 30% of their customer base on an annual basis. Now, what if that was reduced from 30% to 25%? How would that impact the organization's profit? Well, the answer to that, it's massive, absolutely massive. If you read Reichelt's books or his articles, and if you're interested in more, just email me and I'll send you some of the white papers published in the Harvard Business Review. But let's have a look at this across some of these verticals, and the books actually deal with a lot more of these verticals. But in business banking, if a commercial bank was able to retain just 5% more of their accounts, their profitability would increase by that. Credit insurance, retail, let's pause on retail. Many of us shop at various supermarket chains, not necessarily the same one every time. I'm probably a candidate for that. I probably shop at 4 different supermarket chains, and for no particular reason. I prefer some fresh fruit and vegetables in one to another. But if any given supermarket was able to reduce the amount that I spend in the competitors, their profitability out of my spend would increase by a massive 50%. Mobile phone market. The churn in mobile phone is probably in Africa a lot higher than 45. These are American figures. I would predict that South African mobile churn rates are up in the 50% plus. Software. But no, again, the big one is credit card. There it is, 125. And that's because in the credit card environment all over the world, we're seeing massive switching between one card to the next, drawing cash from one to pay the other. It's the way credit cards have worked in the past. So the astute bank would consolidate all the other cards and incentivize a customer to purely put all their credit card business through a single card. That's how their profitability would manifest. So let's pause on that particular slide. So if we reduce the customer churn in any one of those verticals or whatever industry you might be in, the bottom line increase in profit, there you see the numbers. And it's all can all be substantiated. Let that sink in for a moment. Any questions on that? Because here we have a different view of it, same model, impact of 5% increase in customer retention, but here we are looking at percentage increase in net present value of customer. This goes along with some of our other models, which is lifetime value and how that impacts on organizational value, stock values, etc., etc. So once again, it's doing the same thing as saying, what if we could reduce churn, customer churn? First and foremost, there's software, fixed line telecoms, insurance brokerage, credit card, 75 in this case, branch deposits, and the big one is in life insurance. Once again, very simple model. For every 5% that we can reduce customer churn, that's how it impacts in the long-term value to the organization. So when the boardroom starts questioning our need for tools, technologies, training, etc., to boost customer retention in the call center, this is what we're talking about. These are the slides you should be taking into the boardroom. And there's a lot more information, obviously, in the books. But the model is very simple. Help us to build retention in customers, loyalty, lifetime value, and we as contact center will deliver bottom line profits. So this gets quite exciting. So back to this, why invest in CRM or CX and CX technologies? Let's have a look at it. Cliche. Costs 8 times more to win a new customer than it does to keep an existing customer. Now, every single director in every boardroom I've ever walked into knows this. But it still begs the question, why is it that marketing gets all the big budgets and contact center focusing on customer retention and loyalty has budgets cut? It begs the question. But nonetheless, let's drive on to that. We also know that customer dissatisfaction causes customers to migrate away from us. And particularly in the world of social CRM that we'll be discussing in more detail. And so the statement there, customer retention is the key to a profitable business. And we've got to take these lessons into the boardroom as a justification for how we want to redesign our processes in contact center, our platforms, data integration, the roles that we wish to take over, perhaps from sales, marketing, and distribution, in a total holistic view of re-engineering the business. So, managing customer churn, the difference between profit and loss, and plenty of evidence to support that. Any questions coming up from the floor? Q&A, let me just check. Jackie asking, does retail include store cards as well? Absolutely, Jackie. If we could get more people to use those store cards, and I think a lot of the so-called, I said that with a bit of a pinch of salt, incentives to use store cards. I think we're lacking in a lot of those store cards, don't have the incentive to drive sufficient loyalty. If we just look at the landscape, we've got Woolworths, we've got Pick and Pay, we've got Checkers, we've got Spar, all with loyalty cards. That's just in the FMCG space. Which one are we loyal to? No one in particular. And so I think, Jackie, you raise a really important point there. And I think on our next session, let's look at loyalty programs and examine the impact of that and why they're implemented and what are the consumer benefits. I think there are a lot of organizational benefits which really stem from data analytics that comes through understanding purchasing patterns, etc. But good question. Thanks for that one. So moving on. So where are we? There we go. The social CRM. Now this is changing so fast. So I was reviewing these slides this morning and thinking, my goodness, I need to review this because a year or so since I created the slide deck, the social CRM environment has shifted and has changed quite considerably. So bear that in mind as we go through some of these. So today's customer, and we addressed that in the original session, is less tolerant, more demanding, more informed, etc., etc. So very often our customer interaction may start in the contact center until things go wrong. And we see it so often. The minute things go wrong, they turn to the social media channels, and in some cases, all hell breaks loose. What I'll do before we close the session, there's a couple of short videos that I'll play that kind of reinforce the impact of the social media environment. So even in the 90s and 2000s, CRM was seen to be, I call it the old school way, where organizations decided on what, how, and whom they would market their goods and services. It was a one-way street. So CRM tended to be, my analogy is almost herding sheep. The farmer being the company or the organization driving the sheep from one paddock to another, always on his or her terms. And very often without asking for it. Who recalls receiving those emails back in the day where we were told your relationship manager at the bank was so-and-so? It was all around, we're now in a relationship without really questioning, do I as a customer wish to be in a relationship with my bank? I just want the service component of it. I don't want the intimacy of a relationship. And many of us feel the same way. And good old Gartner always comes up with a gem. Relationships taken for granted have no value. I think that applies both in the personal space as well as in the business and commercial space. And so we tend to take our customer relationships for granted. And if I look at my providers, whether it's just my insurance companies or my banks, credit cards, DSTV, etc., they all do, in my opinion, take me as a customer very much for granted. And we've just got to be careful that when we re-engineer our organizations and our processes, that we don't take customers for granted. So the social media digital revolution, we know it's happening all around us. The proliferation of channels is opening up all the time. The drive by organizations to have, Jackie's question earlier about loyalty cards and store cards etc., all driving customers to take a different view in a different channel. Let me see if my system works here. It should theoretically. I just need to check that we have the correct video settings. All things being equal, just give me a sec. I'm going to stop share now and hopefully play the video. Give me a moment. We have a problem. Okay, before we close off the session, I'll go and find that video file, and we will play that file for you. It's actually quite an important one. So we're back to the slide. Can somebody just on the chat line tell me that you're seeing that screen? Okay, and away we go. There we go. Quentin, thanks a million. You've come in from a long way away. Myanmar, if I remember correctly. Good to have you with us. Okay, so we will play that video towards the end of the session. So back to social CRM, and it's just in this session, all we're looking at is just some numbers. So let's have a look. Facebook. June 2020, and it's probably changed since then, but just have a look at that, 2.45 billion. Somebody do the maths on that and calculate that against the world population of what, 7 billion, whatever it is nowadays. Instagram growing quite significantly. Twitter, funny enough, is dropping off, looking at the stats. At one time, that was up to about 700 million, and it seems to have fallen off. I don't know whether the political situation in the US is driving some of that. Google, 3.5 billion daily searches coming through. Not shown on there, by the way, but I saw that YouTube is second only to Google in terms of searches nowadays. LinkedIn, 500 million. Yes, it's focusing more on the business sector. And Pinterest has grown up to 250 million. So if we just look at those, then as you know, there are many, many more channels that we need to consider. But the big ones up here, of course, are Facebook. So some fairly recent stats. As I said, I did this research in June. 75% of male internet users are on Facebook, and 83% of female users. Teenagers consider Instagram to be more important, and I think that figure has grown. I saw an article the other day, it's around about 40%, so it's growing. Female users more likely to use Instagram, and 29% internet users with college degrees use Twitter compared to 20% with high school degrees. So there's lots more information around this, but this is really just a quick heads up to say we have to take social channels very, very seriously. There are millennials checking their Twitter at least once a day. Well, I think in some cases the research will tell us it's a lot more than that. Instagram users 18 to 29. Go ahead. Facebook continues to be the most widely used social media platform. 79% of American internet users. And so 68% of all US adults are on Facebook. And we're starting to see very, very similar models in various other territories as well. And I know there's been some talk that Facebook is not a serious business channel. Well, I think the evidence is pointing in a different direction, that more and more organizations are leaning heavily on Facebook for lead generation and for primary communications with their customers. And as Facebook's channels the messaging, and very soon we will have a lot more stable video on the Facebook channel. And of course their WhatsApp family, which I haven't shown on these graphs here, that also impacts how we should start looking at re-engineering our communication processes, methods, and channels. So there's that figure. 22% of the world's total population uses Facebook, and I'm sure that's growing. Thank you. So 80% of time spent on social media platforms happens on mobile. Now, we touched on this when we looked at the global trends model, that the smartphone and penetration of smartphone, particularly in the take-up in our area, sub-Saharan Africa, is indicating that smartphone is having a profound impact on how we communicate with and receive communication from our particular target markets. So let's have a look, the next 2 to 3 years, what does it look like? Because we are in a position where we have to start looking at those projections and looking at how do we change our organizations to address that. It's predicted next 2 to 3 years, the volume of social media communication will overtake email. Well, that has already happened in some areas where the pure messaging content coming through from WhatsApp, Facebook, and other channels has, in some areas, far outstretched by 80–90% the volume coming in through email. And not only business engagement, but in customer service. So we've got to look very carefully how we bring social channels into our customer service mix going forward. And of course, the younger generation, 16 to 24-year-olds right now, only know the social networks, and many of those 16 to 24s don't have email accounts of any kind whatsoever, no Gmail, no Yahoo accounts. They're simply using the social channels for all their basic communication. So if we look at this particular generation, 16 to 24-year-olds, they're rapidly coming into our environment as customers. And so it's perfectly natural for them to expect us to service them in their channels of preference, which are the social channels. So any questions on that coming through? So we'll close off today, and we'll pick up, I'll send out the invitations for same time next week, Tuesday, 10 o'clock. So thank you everybody for participating, and I hope you got value out of today, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.